Hey everyone, Cherrick here. I am just following up with Miss Cruz to do a wrap up of The Great Gatsby Chapter 3. I wanted to make a few comments on some of the things that she had to say before we move on. I know my class got a little bit further than hers. So what she brought up at the very end of Chapter 2 is really interesting. My students always surprise me by finding these tiny little details and these little choices that Fitzgerald made that were clearly purposeful that I didn't notice before. And that's why it is something that we still consider to be one of the most important works of American literature, because there are so many layers to it. But yeah, at the end of chapter 2, Nick has this whole missing lapse of time. And I guess in my brain, I've always auto-corrected the time that he wakes up in the train station as being like 4 in the morning. Like, oh, you know, he got really drunk, and so he wakes up at 4 in the morning in a train station, but it's actually 4 in the afternoon, and then there was that stuff with Mr. McKee. So whatever Nick does in his spare time that he doesn't actually write about probably isn't any of our business, but there was plenty of theories on the internet, and Mrs. Day and I had a pretty interesting conversation about that, so whatever. Just spoiler alert, this is not actually a story about Nick, so whatever he does in his spare time is his old thing. But it's so important that this story is told through Nick's eyes. And I want you to think about that as we continue, because this would be a very different story if it was told through the lens of any of the other characters. A few other things about chapter 1 and 2. Characterization. There's so much beautiful characterization in here. The way that they, open the door when we meet Daisy and Jordan for the first time, and then when Tom walks in, how it's almost like all the air is sucked out of the room, literally because he slams the window, but then also figuratively too, because he is such a menacing character, the way that he's described. One thing that Fitzgerald does really well here is he took a note from his buddy Hemingway, and he shows us. He doesn't tell us. He doesn't say, Tom's a big jerk, is cheating on his wife. He lets that unfold slowly in his physical appearance, his mannerisms, and the things he's interested in. And I know we already had a little bit of a conversation about that, but I just wanted to kind of recap that. The green light, right? So Ms. Cruz brought that up. That is what we put as an example of a symbol on your symbolism chart, because it's one of the most obvious. But again, I always have students who are coming up with like new symbols in this book that I'd never even thought about. Try to challenge yourself to go that extra mile and look for stuff that may not be as obvious instead of Googling it. Going on with more symbolism and more imagery, the Valley of Ashes, what could that symbolize, right? Like you have like the leisure and the glamour of everyday life in West Egg and how beautiful everything is, right? And then you also have the glamour and glitz and sparkle and fast pace and excitement of New York City. And then in the middle, you just have this like literal garbage dump. Like you have to go by this in order to get from point A to point B. So what might that symbolize? Just some things to think about. Chapter 3. So it starts out with Nick, who is going to Gatsby's house for a party. Nick actually got an invitation to this party, Gatsby's chauffeur, so he was excited to go. He gets there, and it turns out to be this crazy party. Hundreds of people there. There's a huge orchestra, all these people who are dancing and talking. There's famous people there. Can't find Gatsby anywhere. And every time he asks around about Gatsby, he starts learning like nobody really knows him, but everybody has something to say about him. He finally just kind of gives up on looking for Gatsby. He's hanging out by the bar doing same thing he was doing at the last party, and he runs into Jordan Baker, which is great because they have this thing going on. So they start roaming around the party together, and they're also asking, and they hear some of these rumors about Gatsby. For example, on page 44, people saying, somebody told me they thought that he killed a man once. Oh, no, he was a German spy during the war. And some people said, no, he was in the American army. Again, we don't see him, we're just hearing all about him. Nick wanders into the library with Jordan at some point because, he's not really a big partier. Regardless of what we saw in the last chapter, we get one of these famous lines from Fitzgerald on page 46, where he runs into this owl-eyed man, which he just refers to him as Owl Eyes from here on out, who's just sitting there, and he says, So Ally says, I've been drunk for about a week now, and I thought it might sober me up to sit in a library. But then he also goes on and on about how the books are real, which makes you kind of start to think what else at Gatsby's party might not be authentic, might just be for show. So something to think about for later. There's somebody who's like, who comes up to Nick and is like, hey, you look familiar. Weren't we in the war together? Blah, blah, blah. And Nick's like, yeah, but he's kind of bummed out because he didn't get to meet Gatsby, and the party's like kind of wrapping up. People are getting really drunk. They're starting fights with their spouses, all this stuff. At the top of page 48, where Gatsby reveals himself. He's this guy who was saying they were in the war together. I'm Gatsby, he said all of a sudden. What? Oh, I exclaimed, oh, I beg your pardon. I thought you knew, old sport. I'm afraid I'm not a very good host. And notice we've got that key term, old sport. And if you are keeping an old sport tab, we are up to 3 right now, and we really only have gotten like 7 or 8 lines of dialogue from Gatsby so far. This is where Nick gives us our first impression of him. And this is so beautiful. On page 48, this is where we get this beautiful Leo meme from. He smiled understandingly, much more than understandingly. It was one of those rare smiles with a quality of eternal reassurance in it that you may want to come across 4 or 5 times in your life. It faced, or seemed to face, the whole external world for an instant, and then concentrated on you with an irresistible prejudice in your favor. It understood you just so far as you wanted to be understood, believed in you as you would like to believe in yourself, and assured you that it had precisely the impression of you that, at your best, you hope to convey. Precisely at that point it vanished, and I was looking at an elegant roughneck, a year or 2 over 30, whose elaborate formality of speech just missed being absurd. Here we get this impression of Gatsby and the fact that he's young, which, as Nick says later, he's thought that he would have been more florid and corpulent and in his middle years, but really he's this young man. And he's really confused by it. And now his curiosity is even more piqued. So he says that he would have accepted without question the information that Gatsby sprang from the swamps of Louisiana or the Lower East Side of New York. That was comprehensible. But young men didn't, at least in my provincial inexperience, I believe they didn't, drift coolly out of nowhere and buy a palace on Long Island Sound. We don't really see much more of Gatsby until much later on. We also get a break in point of view on page 55, which reminds us, because we have Nick who's reading, he goes, reading over again what I've seen so far, I've given the impression that blah, 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 let me clarify. This reminds us that Nick is writing this from the future. I want you to think about what that does. For having a point of view of somebody who has already lived through this experience to do this. Think back to freshman year when you guys read To Kill a Mockingbird. And don't get me wrong, I'm sure Scout had a great vocabulary as a 6-year-old, but the fact that she wrote that story as a grown woman made it much more profound and much more moving, getting that reflective perspective. So think about that as we move on to. Somebody comes up and asks Jordan Baker, hey, Mr. Gatsby would like to speak to you alone, and so Nick is just kind of wandering around again. Jordan Baker comes back at the very end and is like, Nick, you're never gonna believe what he told me, speaking of Gatsby. And she's like, call me, look me up in the phone book. Fitzgerald sets up this mystery, this surprise that we're waiting for to come in the coming chapter. And finally, the chapter ends off with Nick thinking about his girl back in Chicago, who he has been writing letters weekly to, saying love Nick at the end. But then on page 58, all he could think of was how, when that certain girl played tennis, a faint mustache of perspiration appeared on her upper lip. This kind of implies he might be slowly falling out of love with this girl because he can only imagine these things that are kind of gross about her. So he decides, I need to break this off if I'm going to move forward with Jordan. So we'll see where that takes us. But he also says, like on the same page, that he's not in love with Jordan. He's just curious. So, well, whatever you have to tell yourself, dude. I guess we'll see where it goes from there. So what I want you guys to do with these 3 chapters is really think about your symbolism chart and what things, what people, what colors, what items, what individual choices that Fitzgerald made when he was writing this book, what they might mean. And it doesn't matter. Like, let's say you fill out that symbolism chart with like a bunch of stuff that never shows up again. That's okay, because the one thing that you do see again and again is really going to help you when you go to write this paper. And I also want you to think about how this is reflective of the modernist era. All right, I hope you guys are doing well. Take care of yourselves, keep up the social distancing, and I can't wait to see you guys again. All right, bye.